All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the This.Labs podcast. I'm your host. My name is Rob Osell. I'm a senior developer at This.Labs. With me this week, as in every week, are my co-hosts. We have James Spivey, who's another senior developer at This.Labs. James, how are you doing?
Good. Yourself?
Good. Also have Tracy Lee, who's a founder of This Dot. Tracy, how are you doing?
Hi.
And we have Jared Overson, a director at Shape Security. Jared, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. Today, our topic is something, last week we did performance. This week, we're going to take a much smaller topic, and we're going to talk about software architecture and systems architecture. Just a nice little bite-sized topic for us today. But before we jump all the way into that, I thought as an icebreaker, something big happened in the development community this last week or 2 weeks, depending on how rich you are. The .dev domains got released. So I don't know, did everybody get any interesting .dev domains? Did you at least get your names?
I didn't bother purchasing my name because I already have a .com, but I did get reverseengineer.dev, and I'm excited with that.
You didn't get don't reuse passwords.dev?
No.
I stole your password.dev. That was a good one. I didn't buy anything, by the way. I figured I shouldn't. I've gone down that path before.
I love, we work with somebody, Katie Fujihara, who's at Katie of Code on Twitter, and she had a really interesting one that I liked. It was jsonderulo.dev. But I just think there's a lot of potential for that. I'm loving the pun space. So I know it was fun watching on Twitter for the entire week, all the people trying to decide whether getting their first name .dev was worth $10,000 and then whether it was worth like $3,000. And then everybody, when they lost out and somebody that had more money or less sense than they did had scooped it up from them. So, it was a fun week. All right. So our topic of architecture, a large topic, an interestingly vast topic, but I thought maybe just to ground the conversation out, a conversation of what is architecture as it pertains to software, what are architects as they exist as a role, because there's probably people out there that know that they work alongside architects, they work alongside senior devs, but they don't really understand why there's a difference or even if there should be a difference between them. Does anybody want to start out and sort of just give their take off the top of their head, how they've perceived that difference?
Yeah, architecture as a role it's an interesting concept. There's all these different frameworks and languages that we have to write in, and it, sort of the higher you go in terms of architecture, the more abstract things become, the more future looking you have to be. So a senior dev can focus on writing a component or structuring out some complex code, but overall the architecture then becomes like, what's my long-term vision? What am I trying to accomplish? And seeing how that divides up per job, per company you work with, it's often very fuzzy. And I find that, sometimes you'll have a director who's more hands-on, sometimes you'll have a director who's more hands-off. So I don't think there is a great definition for this is what an architect does, because that role will shift no matter where you are.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I generally have worked as an individual contributor or manager at smaller companies, and the difference between developer, manager, and architect is very, very fuzzy. And I think it's normal because in smaller companies, you've got to wear a lot of hats depending on the task at hand. But as companies grow and those roles need to have better boundaries drawn around them, the architect role and developer role becomes more clear because the responsibilities are more clear.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when you start talking about architects or just the role that the architect is playing on a lot of teams, in my opinion, a lot of it has to do less with how individual components are going to be built and much more about this system that we're trying to build. Where is it situated? Does it have physical components to it? Does it have devices that are going to be tied into it? Who are the users that are going to be using the system? How will they be using it? And in particular, I think one of the important things that architects do is pay attention to some of the non-functional requirements, right? The things that they're not necessarily features. They're not like a form that you fill out, but they're these things that often come in competition with one another. Like Jared, you're probably super familiar with the trade-off between security and performance, or even security and usability. And so, you know, it's really typical to have a customer or your own company say, well, we want it to be fast, we want it to be secure, we want it to be usable, you know, we want it to be X, Y, Z at the same time. And as soon as you give those requirements to a developer and they look at it and they just go, okay, but if I add this, it's slower. So do I add this or do I not? And I think that's basically the answering of those questions is sort of what architects do.
Well, and further to that too, I think another very important role for architects is to set a good standard across, you know, the project that you're working. One of the things that I find, you know, everyone has their own unique kind of coding style, and everyone has sort of the things they agree with in terms of rules and linting, and then ones they disagree with. And ultimately, the architect's job is to sort of coalesce all of that together, get something that a team can agree on, and then keep all the team on that sort of same page. Because no one wants to come into a code base that's just 5 different people's opinions on how it should be done, and then it's just chaos, and you can't help with other projects or other areas. You're stuck looking at the stuff, trying to reason about it. So setting good expectations for a team and standards that the team can all agree to and work by, I think it's a massive productivity booster and an important role for an architect. I was recently talking to someone, and they said it best that, you know, sort of the more senior you get, the more of a multiplier you are, and those types of things are what are multipliers to me.
Yeah, I think one of the clearest examples of architect versus developer is somebody who takes extra care and consideration for the protocols of communication across different parts of the system. So it could be something as simple as the API that is driving a web form, or the protocols between microservices, or the what is exposed and what is not exposed, and a data pipeline, things like that. Those are the types of decisions that can be glossed over, and everything can work fine. But down the line, there's inevitably going to be a problem that could have been solved by an architect-like person making better long-term decisions. So version protocols, extensible protocols. There are lots of things that can be done. And that I see as being one of the critical roles of an architect, is seeing into the future and making the correct decisions and trade-offs necessary now that get to a finished product faster, but also enable more rapid iteration in the future.
This is actually quite a fascinating conversation, because I, you know, just in dealing with a lot of people, or just in thinking in general, right? Okay, you're a senior software engineer. Okay, what does it mean to be an architect, right? Same thing as going from a mid to a senior, maybe. Like, you know, how did you guys, like, when you think about architect, you know, because you guys have all kind of served that role in some sense of a fashion, right? Do you just know when you get there? Is that just kind of a thing? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, how do you know when you're going from a mid to a senior? How do you know when you're going from a senior to an architect? Or do you just, you know, is it just like, I know because I've been doing it for years kind of situation?
Yeah, you don't know until you've been it for 5 years.
Right. I was just going to say, yeah, I was just going to say, I got into it because I got thrown into it. It wasn't oh yeah, now I'm an architect. It was, here's all this extra responsibility. This is the architectural stuff. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wow, I'm the architect. And they're like, oh yeah, you are the architect. And so it kind of became, it was like, we came to this mutual conclusion that, yeah, I guess I am the architect on this one. And then just kind of stayed there.
But it's kind of like, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was just saying, it's something too that you, the whole, like, what you start to realize after you've been doing it, right? Because a lot of people call themselves architect because it's a more powerful title. And that's fine. You know, maybe they're just a tech lead, but they'll call themselves an architect, or they're just a senior, but they call themselves an architect. And, you know, this isn't about gatekeeping, but one of the things that you'll start to realize, I think, when you become an architect, or you're having that role on the team that you're on, is you start to realize, like, I haven't coded in a little while. Like, I've been doing like these different diagrams. I've been talking a lot to the customer and the users. I've been coordinating with a lot of devs, but I haven't written a feature in like 6 months. And you're like, I just became an architect. You know what I mean? Like, that's not to say architects don't code, but you tend to be working at a level of abstraction that's just sort of one up from that. And like James was saying with the sort of the multiplier effect, is you're really getting your most value by enabling your seniors and your mids and your juniors to do what they do best, which is to implement individual features. And you're doing the orchestration to make sure that when they finish that feature and these people finish this feature, they coalesce together to form a well-functioning system. So you start to realize that you're doing a lot more of enabling than you are of producing yourself.
Yeah, Arya Hidayat, and a long-time mentor for me and a previous boss, had a good perspective for 3 roles in technical positions. So developer, architect, and people leader, and how developers require a lot of technical knowledge, will be working on code for the majority of their time, benefit from people skills and collaboration, but the tolerance for reduced experience there is greater. And then architect is a combination of leadership skills and technical skills, where you're going to be doing more with people and coordinating across teams and planning, but you're still going to be very technically minded. And then there's people management and more HR focused roles, which still benefit from a technical minded person, but require a lot more people skills, and the tolerance for not performing well with people there is much reduced. So architect and thinking about an architect in that way is kind of like a middle ground between people management and development, where you're still making large decisions. You still have to grow a lot of trust across a lot of different teams and be a leader, but it's not necessarily that you are dealing with HR minutia on a daily basis or planning along those levels.
Great. And I think we should reiterate here too that, conversations about kind of what our experience are of either fulfilling the architect role or what have you on different projects is not meant to be a gatekeeping. It's not meant to negate. If you call yourself an architect, if you're fulfilling that role on your team, but you don't feel like you're doing some of these things, you're probably doing just fine, right? Like most people, when they become a senior or they become an architect or they become a CEO of a company, sometimes, a lot of times you are just doing what you need to do on your team. And it's later on that you apply a label to it and you realize, I was working as the architect in that role, and that's fine. And there's times when people that are architects work as individual contributors or work as project managers or work as sales staff. So, architect is more of a role that people slide into and out of. It's not like a club that, you earn the right to join or, are rejected admittance to, for sure.
It's immensely fuzzy, yeah.
So I have a question, which is, a lot of people that are listening to this might be thinking when they think architecture, they're like, oh, serverless architecture, or, microservices, or, the N-tier architectures, or, different ways to reorganize front ends and things like that. They think architecture are these patterns. So my first question is sort of, when you guys are sitting down with a system that you're maybe sort of planning out, what are the thought processes that are going on, and what are the things that you're asking and the things that you're looking at before you are assigning one of these grandiose patterns to the system that you're on?
From my perspective, a lot of it's typically based around what does my end client have sort of the budget and time for. Certain patterns cost a lot more money to implement. They're a lot more extensive. Their return on investment, is a little lower. While there are certain things, like you mentioned, serverless, where it does give you a certain platform to be able to sort of spin up ideas quickly or for lower cost, with less overhead, less people, maybe even less different technologies, where that kind of program can get you and your idea to market a lot quicker, but it might not be as extensible or as upgradable. it can have its own limits. Everything has a balance in terms of what its cost is versus what its benefits are, and a lot of our architectural role is determining what that looks like. You know, how can we get something to market, but get it to market within what the expectations are for the project, and that's very variable. And sometimes it's even just looking at what's existing and can we reuse it, so it's not even changing to a new architecture, it's just adjusting. Or maybe it is. You know, I've had projects that have gone from massive overhead Java backends that cost significant AWS bills, and we were able to refactor everything into a serverless node functions on Firebase and cost significantly less money. So sometimes those are the types of things that you invest in.
Yeah, cost can be sometimes the most powerful of the non-functional attributes. When if you had infinite money, a lot of times the architecture that you might pick could be more elaborate.
One of the hard things to recognize when dealing with all this new technology coming out is to really understand what the cost is going to be. There are a lot of architectures that are coming out that look very promising, but it's hard to do a real good analysis with current technology because the real world evidence isn't there as to what the long-term costs are truly going to be, or how much these are going to scale and how much we're going to save otherwise. It's pretty difficult. And I think that the old Wayne Gretzky saying, you got to skate to where the puck is going, is very true when figuring out what technology to use at a particular time. Because if you're looking to get to market in 3 to 6 months, you're probably going to be best accommodated by existing technology that you can roll out quickly, and you're going to be able to support for a year or two because you're working on a much shorter schedule. But if you're delivering something in 2, 3, 4 years, and you have that runway and you have that plan, and you're trying to time things well there, then you do have to take chances as to where you think the puck is going to be. Then you don't want to invest in something that is going to be out of date and is going to be a massive burden for you, but you don't want to overcommit to something that isn't proven yet. So you have to wiggle back and forth in order to figure out where the best combination of trade-offs is going to be.
Absolutely. And I think there's some interesting studies of things that have happened out there in that space. A lot of us spend a fair amount of time from an architectural level watching where technology is going, following Twitter, reading blogs, watching what major companies are doing. Obviously, companies like Google are investing a lot of money into Angular, Facebook a lot into React, but there's the sort of ancillary companies that deal with these technologies that I find really interesting. The shift of Airbnb, and sort of they've spent a lot of time and investment in React, and then they did React Native, and then they ultimately decided it didn't work for them. And so while that still works for Facebook, some of these other companies, it doesn't necessarily work for other big players, and it leaves you kind of looking at it going, well, which way do I go? And that's a tough question. I don't think there's a great answer to, other than here's my specific requirements, and then just getting down and looking at it and saying, does this work? But we all ultimately want to avoid that scenario where we invest a lot of time and money into something and have it disappear. As an old Flex guy, there's a lot of companies that are feeling the pain of having invested a lot of money in building Adobe Flex, and then all of a sudden it's essentially dead, and it's very hard to find people that can write it and money like that. And a lot of people feel that kind of burn of, I've spent millions of dollars writing this, and now I've got to rewrite it again. And how do you justify that? How do you work out of that is the ultimate question. And making that 2-year investment, like you said, of you don't want to invest 2 years in Adobe Flex and then have it suddenly die.
And that is a very good extreme example of a technology that was actually really, really fantastic. Adobe Flex was extremely capable. It just was at the tail end of its viability compared to other platforms that were emerging. And then there's something like HTML5, which took the world by storm. Even Steve Jobs and Apple famously predicted that the future of applications were going to be web pages that you could just go to and get all the functionality you need. But there was a time of just overinflated expectations where everyone was doubling down on it, and it just didn't pan out in the time frame people were expecting. I think LinkedIn also famously made their fully HTML5 application, and they touted it as an excellent example of what you can do with web technologies. And then they scrapped it because it just wasn't scaling to what they need. And I think that the early days of single page applications, back in the backboney Angular 1 days, where people were trying to make web pages applications, and they didn't scale to the level they needed to, and that kind of caused the entire industry to contract a little bit and then expand further with all the learnings that they had. But that's another example of just a fantastic technology, the right direction, but the wrong time, causing a lot of cost and churn.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's a lesson here, and it's really applicable beyond just architecture. It's really everywhere, that, you know, you're going to see a lot on Twitter. You're going to hear a lot at conferences. You're going to read a lot of blog posts of people that are trying out these new patterns. They're finding the cool successes of them for their particular use cases. And that FOMO can set in, right? The fear of missing out. And I think when you are working on your own system, when you're trying to deliver something, I mean, you guys can correct me if you're wrong, but in my opinion, sticking to something that you know and your team knows and that you guys can implement well is probably going to work out for you, even if it's considered antiquated as an approach, than jumping into one of the newer patterns or the newer tech stacks that just because it's popular. Because there's just so many times where if you do something new wrong, it's much worse than if you did something that's considered obsolete but did it very, very well. So I think, you know, part of architecture, even beyond the types of problems that you're trying to solve, even beyond trying to track where technology is going, is knowing what your own staff is and what your own capabilities are. It's fun to experiment. It's fun to learn and diversify and to read. But I think you have to know what your architecture is doing for you and know how to fit it into your use case. Because these things don't just automatically manifest rewards, right? You don't just say, I'm doing serverless, and then all of a sudden, boom, your whole system is just completely fast and completely secure, and, you know, it just all comes to you automatically. Like, you have to use these patterns right, or they can backfire on you.
Absolutely. And you know, and that's, I've been watching some of these debates right now. You know, there's different things. Like, one of the ones that I continue to see a lot of is the GraphQL versus the REST approach. You know, a lot of companies right now, that's a really big one of, do we go to this graph model, and does that work? And I think GraphQL is great. I think it's awesome that it empowers developers to be able to get the things that they want, but that doesn't necessarily always end up being what you want. That's not necessarily the thing that fits a particular project. And like you said, it's not just plugging in GraphQL and all of a sudden everything's great. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind implementing GraphQL to get it right for all the other systems that GraphQL has to ultimately talk to. And so it's looking at, will this be a multiplier for our team? Will this help us move quicker, or will it just create more churn and more issues? And that's why I don't think there's a great ending argument. You know, there's not one technology that ever solves all the problems. Everything comes with its own overhead.
I think that's where one of the important parts of being an architect come in, where you can say, no, it's not the right time, and allow a team to progress without the hottest technology. I think there's a very strong case to be made for letting the bigger, richer companies play around with the extreme edge, because they have the resources to navigate multiple paths and then just throw away every single one that doesn't work and commit to the one that does work. While a smaller company, you're putting all your resources on one development path, and when you put all your eggs in one basket and you make the wrong decision, it costs you so much more. So there's a lot of fantastic technology out there. I remember early days in Kubernetes land. I mean, it makes, like, you can see that it's going to be important. You can see that it's going to be something that you'll need to invest in. But going through the first few years of headaches there costs small companies so much more. And when you take on an architect-like role or a senior developer, sometimes it's important to say no and put the brakes on something that you know is going to be important in the future, but it's not right for the project now.
I absolutely agree. It's kind of one of my passion items when it comes to architecture. There's a quote that I came across recently that said, and I haven't verified it was said, but I believe it's true. At least I like to believe it. But it was, any fool can write code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that humans can understand. And that comes to me in a lot of different formats, but especially true for when it talks about architecture is writing patterns and code that the whole team can actually work with. If you're an architect and you're writing this cutting, bleeding edge thing, and you're the only one that understands it, and you're the only one that's written it, and the rest of the team can't operate in it, ultimately you're probably harming the team, because the team now has a black box thing that they don't have a lot of insight into. I'm a big fan personally, and most of the teams I've worked under have heard, is I like libraries, frameworks, tooling that have great documentation, because that enables a whole team then to learn and get up to speed with something. And it's really, it tends, with great docs, you tend to have a product that's a little bit more mature. And so you have a bit more stability with it because they've taken the time to do that. I think, Tracy, you can kind of speak to that, as the time that was spent on the RxJS docs was pretty substantial, but it's very, very helpful because it is such a core part of a lot of spas now that are all using it in the Angular land and beyond, and it makes a big difference for people to be able to get up to speed with.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, did it take a lot of time? I think the first iteration took a long time. The second iteration that we went through didn't take as much time as obviously writing the docs from scratch. But yeah, I mean, I think we definitely see that like in all the projects we work on and all the sort of like open source documentation that we get asked to work on. It's a really big part of every project.
Cool.
When you see that a lot on Twitter, right? Is a lot of people asking, first time contributors, everyone thinks, oh, you have to get into the code to be a contributor. I think most OSS maintainers would absolutely love for people to contribute more to the docs, because it does have that impact on architectural decisions on who picks what and how we operate with it.
Yeah, but I think the biggest problem as well is also just getting everything out of everyone's brain. It's actually one of my favorite things, like when you, I guess, I guess I can, I don't know if I'm talking about RxJS architecture in general, but like when I look at, the documentation and kind of the things that people have the biggest problem with, sure, it's, okay, what operator do I use, etc. But it's really when you can kind of get into Ben's brain and figure out all the different nuances on how to specifically architect things right, what you're using, what you're not using. Like Jared said, using a technology too much and kind of over-investing and then realizing that like, hey, this actually wasn't a scalable idea and things like that. So I wonder how, I'm trying to think, like Angular and React, and Vue, there haven't really been that many notable things that kind of say like, hey, here's best practices for architecture in general. I don't know if any of you have seen them, but I sure have.
Angular has the John Papa was the foundation of writing that style guide.
Mm-hmm.
That style guide has a lot of very good architectural things of do's and don'ts, things to avoid, things that are great ideas. And obviously it's not the Bible. You're not required to follow exactly what the style guide says. But I, generally speaking, like it as a good starting point for getting a team to be on the same page with some best practices and some of those things as a starting point. And every team, especially the larger ones, Airbnb has their standards, Google has their standards, all these different teams have their internalized, these are the things that we expect from a style perspective. But overall, like especially in the Angular world, where Angular is very opinionated, that style guide, those docs are a great founding place for, especially for junior coders who you're trying to kind of get spun up into a team to go, I want you to open this and I want you to read through the whole thing and ask questions and sort of see how it fits within what we're doing things. And that is such a multiplier in terms of quickly getting someone up and integrated into a project, is having that type of resource.
It's kind of interesting to see also that, like, when you guys talk about architecture, so when I think about architecture, not being an architect, I'm like, oh man, it's this thing that I don't know about. And I think a lot of people feel that way, right? Like they're like, oh, I'm not an architect yet, or whatever. And the way you're talking about it, James, you're making it feel so like, oh, if I follow the style guide, I'm architecting my application the right way. So it's almost making architecture seem more like less scary, right?
Shared architecture.
Yeah.
So looping back to something that I mentioned at the start, I think documentation is very much a communication protocol that needs to be architected in the same way all other communication protocols need to be architected. Documentation is not just vomiting out a bunch of words related to the topic at hand. It's crafting the message necessary to impact the end user as greatly and as quickly as possible in order to get them going to where they need to go as quickly as possible. And I think that's another aspect of being an architect and architecture that is often overlooked. But when you see a project that has fantastic documentation, that is spot on for the needs at hand, then it multiplies everyone who jumps into a project. And I think that's where a lot of the care and the communication protocols can benefit, is that they predict how things are going to be used effectively and account for that in the development. And
yeah, and I think as a perfect continuation of that is, and I wasn't thinking about this earlier, but I think for any good architect, for any good manager, really for anybody who has people that work underneath them in any level, one of the best things that you can do is to give people the tools to be able to break tough decisions themselves, right? Like empower people. That's like the biggest differentiation between micromanagement, where you're making all the decisions for people, and empowering people is you're giving them principles that are relevant at their level, right? You're not telling them the business objectives, the client objectives, the things you're thinking of, the costs, the contract length, your quarterly goals. You don't want to put that on the people underneath you, because that's stuff they can't have any control over, right? So you want to distill those principles into things that make sense to them. And then have those people communicate back how what they've decided meets the principles you laid out to them. And then you evaluate and you change, right? So in the case of architecture, what we were doing on some teams that I've worked on before, when we would do software designs, which I don't know if this is a lost art or what, but people would lay out features before they worked on them. And we would have a section of those designs where people had to specifically state the architectural principles, the non-functional requirements that were that were relevant to their section, the thing that their feature affected. And then they had to say why this met those. And if they had alternatives, why this version that they picked was better than the alternatives based on those principles. And that was just great, because it gave comfort to the architect, because they were like, yep, these people are thinking along the right lines. This is great. They're making the right choices. And it helps the people who, at that time, it was actually probably me doing it, like the individual contributor, to understand architecture, for one, two, to have confidence that I was making the right decision without having to constantly, bring things to the architect for approval, and just really helps the team, document that they're meeting their objectives, because you've left this trail of setting principles and then trying to tack to those principles along the way. If you make mistakes, you make mistakes. If you're wrong, you're wrong. But at least the effort was there, and then you've left yourself stuff that you can go back and iterate on, improve on, and learn from.
I did a lot of that with government contracts, and it changes a lot of perspective of how you look at things, when you're drawing it out ahead of time as opposed to just kind of jumping in. And I very much agree with you that it's setting that level at the team that you're involved with is helping lift all of them up, rather than doing something so complicated or designed in a way that they can't be involved, because then ultimately you're just harming or slowing a team. So, operating on that same level, and some of those design decisions are really important, I think. I'm trying to find it. There was a really great GitHub that was created that it was just it's like a little PDF basically. And this is Angular specific since that's where I spend most of my time, but it was little cards that you could kind of write down what your components were and how they related and what sort of their details were. And it's very much sort of what you're talking about in that software design thing. And you could actually kind of physically sketch out what the pieces of an app were first. And I love that stuff. I think it's great. I think it is a lost art that, you know, you still get some of it on whiteboarding, but not nearly as much as we used to.
And two things that I wanted to mention here for resources, because I thought they're really great. I think earlier we asked the question, you know, how can people see these examples of good architectures and how you would think about setting up an architecture for your project? Jason Miller did this phenomenal piece about different, I think he was calling them holotypes for different sort of web apps. And if you just Google for application holotypes, you should be able to find it. It's relatively recent, and it's so great. It goes through all these different types of apps, whether you're trying to make a media player like, you know, like Spotify, or whether you're trying to make a social media app, or you're trying to make a marketplace or a blog. And it kind of lays out what are the general types of problems that those sites have or try to solve. And then it lays out the type of sort of front end or even back end architecture that would seemingly most readily solve that problem. And at a minimum, what it'd give you is just some insight into how to tackle these, or how to identify what it is you're trying to solve, and also some examples of some architectures that if you're not familiar with them, it certainly gives you some reading material, some stuff to get up to speed on as examples of how other people are solving problems, right? Just keep expanding that toolbox. I think there's one other example that I had, and I've trotted this out a bit, but Lee Byron did this phenomenal series of talks over several years where he slowly builds up this case for a unidirectional data flow, GraphQL, immutable data structures, you know, using Redux and similar concepts. And you just see this evolution if you watch this talk over time. And he finally lands on this way to structure servers, the back end and the front end, and the organization of your data, which just helps you with performance. It helps you with correctness. It helps you with, you know, understandability, maintainability, scalability, all these issues. And I've probably watched his most recent talk. I don't have the title of it right in front of me, but I've probably watched that talk, you know, 5 or 6 times all the way through, because I get something else out of it every time. So I think if you go and reach out for finding these types of videos where people just explain how they structured their system and why and what benefits it gave them, you know, don't blindly apply that to your project. Don't migrate your whole system over to it. But just try to hear it, understand it, see what problems it solves, so that in the future, if you hear those similar types of problems, you're like, hey, I think I have an idea on how we could solve this. Does anybody else have any other go-to resources or things that in their experience doing architecture have been super meaningful to them or super useful?
Finding mentors is my favorite thing. Asking people, just having conversations, right? I mean, I don't know where you can find, you know, all the architects in your area, but just having open conversations about it on Twitter, maybe even, right? Like asking people how they do things would be really helpful. Writing about it, write about your, you know, experience doing architecture so that we can all learn from it.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to, if you're an individual contributor, if you're somebody that wants to be an architect someday, but you're not, schedule time with your architect and say, why did you make this decision? Like, what are you thinking about? You know, start to ask them for some of the parameters that they're operating on. Pitch some of your own ideas. Like, I thought about this. They'll give you back feedback on whether that's a great idea or some things that you weren't thinking of. Do not be afraid to ask the people that are right there next to you for that kind of help and that kind of guidance. I mean, that's whether they meant to or not. A lot of the architects I've worked with as I was, you know, coming up in my career, I think back, I didn't realize at the time how much I was learning from them, but I look back on it and realize that it was invaluable.
I think that's in a continuation of that. Another really good one is to challenge architects. You know, we're all human beings. We don't know everything. You might have information that we haven't seen or an idea that we've never dealt with before from something else you've learned. And it's a thing that can be implemented. Maybe not always, you know, sometimes, kind of like you said, there's things that an architect deals with that you don't necessarily, as a you know, someone below them can see or understand. But that challenge, that sort of like, hey, I had this idea, or, why did you do that? Because I think we could do this. Those are great. It's a collective knowledge base, and I think it highlights and should help remind like every level that there's always someone that knows something that we don't, and we're always just constantly learning. And so don't be afraid to say, hey, I saw this, because the architect might have made a decision that probably wasn't the best, and you could have had a better idea. So you can make architectural level decisions and not even be an architect or realize you or have those same abilities.
That's a very good point. I think to go along with what Rob was saying too, asking why is very good, but also why didn't you make the 90 other decisions you could have made in order to progress forward? Because each one of those decisions to do something or to not do something is just as important. And James is right. There's a lot of experience that every individual holds in a company that is just a function of the way you've lived your life and the troubles that you've had to go through in order to get to where you are. All of that experience is extremely valuable. And the person who's in charge of you or in charge of a project, they don't have all the right answers, and they need and will benefit from the collective experience of everyone around them working on the project in order to make better decisions. So absolutely, question everything and propose new solutions, because it might be that you are the only person who has thought of that. And even if you're not, having a good discussion as to why that might not be appropriate is just an excellent way to learn.
And just being cognizant, though, of, while that is also very important, that there are certain things that, while you've got that idea, maybe it can't be implemented. So don't be upset if your idea ultimately doesn't make it, but do it. Don't back down. Everyone can learn from each other or challenge preconceived notions, and no one is always going to be right for everything. So it's a great way to get that skill set.
100%. Yeah, no, that's awesome feedback, right? Like, I think software teams are bettered when not everybody is just sort of blindly following along in lockstep agreement, right? You want those people that find the right times. I mean, that's the other piece of this, right? I know I've mentored people in the past where I've said, listen, like, I love that you question things on the teams that you're on. I love that you are in there asking those questions. But if you are constantly derailing every meeting by demanding justifications and pitching your idea and forcing a vote on everything, like, you're making more enemies than you're making friends. So there is a political aspect to this too, but that's why sometimes the mentorship offline is so good, to catch your architects not in meetings with 10 people in them, forcing them to defend what they're saying, but definitely get involved. And certainly if you disagree, with what's going on, air it out, find them separately, find them after the meeting, find them one-on-one, pitch your idea. If it gets completely squashed, I've seen people that have tried to go out and prove it. Like, they try to do like a little proof of concept on the side, or they try to go do some research. That's awesome too. And you're going to lose some. You're going to lose some sometimes in unfair ways. Sometimes the architect's just going to go, I just want it this way. It's not as big a deal as you think it is. I just want it done. It needs to get done. We're just going to do it this way. It's just as good as any other way. And sometimes you got to swallow that. If it happens every single time you bring it up, maybe you got to look for a different place to work. But you are going to get shut down sometimes, even when you were right in the end. Try to be a graceful winner. But
those are important aspects of business that are very often overlooked at lower levels. Is that there's so much data coming in and so many trade-offs being made with every single decision. That sometimes the right decision is to just go forward with whatever you've got and then get to the next decision and then get to the next decision. So it might feel like it wraps everything up nicely if you can have the right decision at every juncture. But sometimes, to be very frank, it might not matter at all. You just need to get to the next decision and work on that one and when it comes.
Absolutely. We've all had the late night meeting of, well, the VP said it was due here, and so we got to get it done, and you don't have a choice now because he's expecting it. So it's like, all right, well, we're in the get it done mode now. and hopefully we can come back and clean some of this up later. But yeah, sometimes you have to make those tough choices, and it's not the most fun feeling, but that's part of the hard part, I guess, of being an architect sometimes.
Yeah, the architect role, and this kind of goes back again to something we were saying earlier, is that you're in it when you've been in it for several years. The architect role is one of those roles that really does require somebody to have seen mistakes over and over and over again to understand what's going to be coming in the future and how this choice might bypass 9 out of 10 of those problems that you're inevitably going to get. And I think that's where there's a lot of benefit from experience, is just not making a mistake that everyone will make twice or 3 times.
Yeah, and there's sort of the last little piece I have in thoughts on that is one of the things that we do a lot at this dot, and I like places that do it more, and sometimes I haven't had the option, but is doing group PRs, is reviewing each other's things so that you see both the architectural decisions made from architects, you have everyone evaluating your code, and you're all learning from each other. And I've had some companies where that wasn't a possibility, and it all had to roll up to the architect, and it was his job to do all the PRs. And I don't like that system nearly as much as when sort of everyone's reviewing each other's stuff, because it keeps a lot of people on the same page, and it challenges a lot of those assumptions and allows you to do a lot of that sort of why are we doing this, and doing it in an isolated way that doesn't necessarily derail everything.
For sure. And I mean, if you're an architect listening to this and you're wondering the ways to be more effective, I think scheduling small meetings often enough to just talk about recent decisions or upcoming decisions, make your pick, right? Or switch it up. And just getting the team together and letting them play the role of the architect, letting them pitch different ideas, just doing it as a team building exercise, it has helped morale on teams I've worked on so immensely in the past, because all of a sudden people went from just being ticket robots, right? Like I have my inbox of tickets, my outbox, to being these people that feel like they own a piece of the architecture. Like they get what's going on. When a new problem comes in, they're starting to make those assessments themselves. And then when the architect says it, they're like, oh crap, I got it right. You know what I mean? So like, it really helps. Like you might think I can't afford to spend an hour every couple weeks or something, or 30 minutes every couple weeks to do this. You definitely can. It will pay dividends in better work, stronger developers, and just better morale. I 100% agree with that. Okay. Well, great. Well, this is a great place for us to stop. That went by really quickly, talking about architecture. We certainly will come back to this topic again in the future. So if there's anything we didn't talk about, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach all of us on Twitter. We'll go over that in a second. But before we close up, okay, so our last time we did this, we talked about the cooking channel, which is quite popular in this dot. Now, another popular channel in the this dot Slack is the parenting channel, right? It's for parents of tiny humans and of small animals. So so today's topic is sort of any interesting parenting topics that you have or that have occurred to you in the last week or couple weeks. And I will say mine, which I've been griping about on Slack recently, which is that our child is almost 2, missed out on the Baby Shark craze the first time. He was not interested in it at all, right? Absolutely did not like the song. My wife, because he was obsessed with a different song, decided to try and distract him and had Alexa play the song recently. And now my entire life is Baby Shark. And I know this is like the slowpoke meme here. I know I'm months behind everybody else, but I mean, just day after day, nonstop. I mean, thank God he doesn't know how to activate Alexa. But that's mine. So, you know, if you want to send some thoughts and prayers to my family that's just inundated in Baby Shark. How about Tracy? What you got? Any interesting
Parenting?
Well, that's true, I guess. Well,
well,
you can talk about other people's cute kids, I guess. That's what works too.
My husband tries to parent me all the time, but that's a different topic, I think. I'm trying to think of all the way he tries to parent me, but anyways, but I could Baby Shark, doo, 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 Baby Shark, doo, 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 doo.
Somewhere in the house, he's probably singing it with you right now.
Yes, I love it. What about you, Jared? You have 3 little ones, yeah?
Yes. So This weekend, I had a workshop at the Whopper Summit, which was a hacking convention. So Whopper stands for the War Operations Planned Response. It's the computer from war games. And it was a great experience, and it was great to be able to bring my family there. And we had Bianca, I don't know her last name, BIA Scilab on Twitter. I think she's like 13 years old. She taught my kids how to solder, and it was fantastic watching them play with extremely hot tools and molten metal and being terrified and wanting us to do it for them. But then eventually getting to the point where they were soldering their own circuits and making their own LEDs pop up. So Rob and anyone with small kids, do dangerous things with your children early. Get them over those hurdles of fear and terror, because it amounts to really cool stuff quickly.
Great. James, your little fur babies?
We do. Our big breakthrough this weekend was we have a feral foster dog. We foster rescue dogs, dachshunds, and we had a feral dog. She's never had owners in her life, lived out in the wild her whole life, and we've had her for almost 2 years, and she's been deathly afraid of everyone. And this weekend, she let my dad pet her, and then she came and snuggled with me, which was, while it sounds very small, that was a massive, massive breakthrough for her, and we were super, super excited for her because we've been working so hard with her to get her comfortable with humans, and to have that moment happen was really, really special.
That's cool.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you to all my hosts for being here as well. Like I said, you can find us on Twitter. So Tracy, thank you so much for joining us. You can find her on Twitter at LadyLeet. James, thanks as well. And you can find him on Twitter at MySpivey. So it's MySpivey. And Jared as well, thank you so much for being here. And you can find him on Twitter at JSOverson, which is JSOVERSON. My name is Rob, and you can find me on Twitter at Robocell. That's ROBOCELL. And yeah, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you the next time. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.